Well, thank you for having me. A mere dabbler also in the work of Michel Serres. I'm a theologian. So to begin with, Pioneer 10, the American space probe, launched in 1972, one of the first artificial objects built to achieve the escape velocity needed to leave the solar system. It crossed the orbits of Saturn, Neptune and Uranus, and then passed into deep space. Its final weak signals were received on 23rd of January 2002, after which time contact was lost. It's currently predicted to be around 18.3 billion miles from the Earth. Now, as you may know, in anticipation that it might travel far enough to encounter intelligent extraterrestrial life, and at the instigation of Carl Sagan, one of the NASA engineers, Pioneer 10 was fitted with a 6 by 9 inch gold anodized aluminium plaque. Along with other symbols, the plaque featured the nude figures of a human male and female, drawn by Sagan's then wife, Linda Saltzman. For NASA, these were intended to represent a typical human physiology. Sagan himself commented that, quote, "The man and the woman are to a significant degree representative of the sexes and races of mankind. This is human nature itself, as it were," end quote. But can we really isolate and depict a species' nature in this way, independent of what we might call a species' culture? After all, consider what cultural representations are encoded even in this plaque. To start with, we might reasonably ask why the figures are naked. For most people across the world, the norm is to wear clothes. Or again, consider how the male figure is shown with his hand raised, apparently taking the lead in hospitality. The female figure keeps her arms by her side, turned slightly towards the man, maybe indicating passivity or even deference. Perhaps unsurprising that this attempt to represent the general state of our species drew the ire from feminists and others who argued that a series of asymmetrical cultural representations were embedded in what was claiming to show humans just as we are. Perhaps any alien observers to come across this probe in deep space would have a sense of the contestations raging in the world down below and choose not to make their journey. I use this rather banal example as an entry point for some brief reflections on human nature in the context of cultural development. Is there really such a thing as an essential human nature that can describe in a universal way who we are and how we ought to act towards one another? Or is human nature inextricably bound up in its cultural manifestations? In other words, I'd like to inquire about the contributions of both nature and culture to a vision of morality and the common good, and in particular through an evolutionary lens. And in this way, perhaps we can address the question Serres himself poses: why on earth did we ever seek to separate nature and culture? For they are linked by a twisted Möbius strip. So to frame these brief thoughts, I'd like to begin with some insights from the disciplinary field of cultural evolution. The core idea of this field is that cultural change constitutes an evolutionary process whose mechanisms are analogous to, albeit not identical with, those of Darwinian genetic inheritance. As such, human behavior is shaped by both genetic and cultural evolutionary factors, with complex interactions taking place between those two over time. So without even further clarification, we can immediately see why cultural evolutionists might be suspicious of essentialist or deterministic depictions of who we are and how we ought to act. This is because for them, there can be no pristine or human nature that could come before the evolutionary adaptations procured by cultural transmissions. Instead, they will insist on a subtle reconfiguration of the nature-culture question by means of what they would call the story of gene culture co-evolution. Now, the classic example in the field here that you will see everywhere relates to the phenomenon of lactase persistence in adulthood. For most of human history, there was little reason for humans to digest milk after weaning, and adults did not typically produce lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose. However, with the advent of practices of cattle domestication, dairying, a genetic mutation that enabled production of lactase into adulthood was strongly favored by selection. So which part of that evolutionary story is of nature and which is of culture? It makes no sense to suggest that our adaptation to drinking milk is somehow independent of the physiology of the human body and its gene inheritance channels. But at the same time, that trait only became advantageous to humans because of the advent of cultural practices that could ensure a consistent source of milk. Pastoralism, stools for sitting on, farming machinery, and so on. The gene culture co-evolutionary story then seeks to map precisely these complex and overlapping cycles of vertical and horizontal transmissions. Now, two brief implications before I turn to the work of Serres. First, then, insofar as we want to talk about the human nature at all, this story will encourage us to frame it in the context of a broader series of developmental processes. What we think of as characteristically human or innate will have emerged through the orchestrating contributions of a wide variety of such processes, both genetic and cultural, none of which are helpfully viewed as predetermining its final state. And so in the lovely phrase of Tim Ingold, we might refer to ourselves as biosocial becomings. Second implication is that this gene culture co-evolutionary story must be taking place at multiple spatial and temporal scales. For cultural traits, often unlike genetic, can be introduced and transmitted in different ways and at different time scales, through chance moments of trial and error, through individual or group interactions over time, or by means of some groundbreaking innovation that suddenly changes how we think and act. Punctuated bursts, as it's called. Perhaps we're living through such a moment even now ourselves. Now, as I'm sure you're already intimating, I think the work of Michel Serres can be helpfully brought into dialogue with this co-evolutionary story at a number of points. So here are two brief observations for discussion and one final application. First observation, I want to claim that Serres does posit a unified concept of nature as the basis of his evolutionary thinking. Now, we must be careful here, of course. This is not the pristine singular entity of Whitehead's critique, that virgin that has remained pure from the various contaminations of history. For Serres, that concept of nature is artificial and of recent provenance. Quote, here in this iteration, nature inflated becomes the set of all existences, the world or the universe, its general equilibrium recognized before all examination. But for Serres, there is a unified concept of nature if nature is understood not as that pristine entity, but rather as the count of the multiple branchings of Earth history. I'm using incandescent here only because I took it with me last week on a flight to Rome. Nature, he says, is the integral of all bifurcations. If somehow those processes could be counted up and aggregated, there we would find nature. The universality of nature is or would be revealed. Yes, nature. That is how we were born. Now, of course, we find in this story, an extremely diverse set of evolutionary branchings. Who on earth could hope to trace them all, to go downwards and back to the trunk? Is there a scientist anywhere that could carry out that task? For everywhere we look, it seems that we find contingency and novelty. Yes, novelty, contingency, emergence, but unpredictability, Serres is not so sure. Each of the bifurcations of nature arises like a dramatic turn of events in the very vicinity of the impossible, yes, like a kind of miracle, but possible, certainly. Maybe like a very low probability event. So as we survey evolutionary history, that marvelous bouquet of novelty and emergence, it seems almost miraculous to our eyes as we look down. But this is because its processes are those of the Earth system itself, multiple, interlaced, full of feedback loops, unimaginably complicated, but ultimately within the remit of cause and effect. Through his concept of nature, therefore, Serres is able to work within a paradigm of a standard deterministic account of natural evolutionary processes. But don't be alarmed, for here is the second claim. I think it's only when we understand this claim, number one, that we can get to number two, that cultural specializations are what differentiate humans and finally define our nature. And we know this story well, and I know Chris has outlined it in his book on the figures of the human. Natural selection, we species move increasingly to the narrow branches of the tree as they are better fitted to their environments through adaptations. In the case of humans, however, we left this kind of durée note. By contrast with other species, we are characterized by de-differentiation, such that in our case, it is as though we were going back to the main branches of the tree, maybe even the trunk. Crucially for Serres, this does not mean that we collapse into blank indifferentiation. For humans, a given distinction, not by their physical or bodily adaptations like animals are, but by their cultural specializations. Quote, we are that totipotent stem species that was born of a reflux in the reverse direction from evolution, and starting from which all cultures are born. To put it another way, the role of morphology in animal evolution, narrower, flatter beaks, longer necks, and so on, is analogous to the role of culture in human evolution. Technological, linguistic, and cultural differences constitute our external species form, he says. So the argument I wish to offer for discussion is that Serres thought he does map onto this gene culture co-evolutionary story. In fact, it takes that story forward by showing not just what is happening here descriptively, but how it ought to affect us. That is to say, he's beginning to infer implications about human moral agency and responsible social organization from that gene culture story. So as I close, here are two principles. I've thought of them as it were sort of boundary walls that we might need to navigate if we want to take up this story that Serres gives us. On the one hand, one boundary wall, we must embrace and continue the cultural innovations that define us as humans. For to have broken out from that biological, those strictly biological processes of genetic evolution and to enter into the world of cultural innovation is to encounter our being as freedom. Other animals are adapted to local and particular environments outside of which they would die. We have the potential to roam. Other animals are regulated to certain types of social behavior. We have the power to choose for better or for worse. quote, the human bifurcates from animals precisely through the minimalization of a pre-established program, a required speciation, a fixed direction, ready-made relations. Without this escape from the deterministic, Serres suggests we would be weighed down by a universal species identity. There would be no possibility of rapid adaptation, disobedience, invention. In fact, we would end up in the hypomnesiac state of the cow, he says, unable to escape the memory of what our genes tell us to do. For Serres, culture is the vehicle through which we engage in the risky and yet joyful enterprise of life. Risky because it can be destructive, the atomic bomb. Joyful because it allows us potentially to extract ourselves from the bitter struggle for survival that characterizes every other species. And so he writes, may the denigrators of technology ponder the charnel house from which it spares us. What is hominization? It is the exit via finality from slowness and death. So if we want to keep on that side of one boundary wall, we also finally need to take account of the other side. We must recognize what we owe to that shared evolutionary story. For what makes us different, our cultural innovations, has its basis in what unites us. The common trunk of the grand narrative gives an unexpected, real and common, chronic thickness to a humanism finally worthy of the name, since precisely all the languages and cultures that came from it can participate in it. Of course, we often seek to elide or escape that shared natural history. We resist its deep growl. We are monsters of forgetfulness. We become creatures of pride, ambition, and short-sightedness, forgetting our roots in that deep concept of nature. Let us then become decentered, writes Serres, and so enter into moral kinship with all. So my proposal is that actually the whole of Serres' work is like a propedeutic for the life of moral kinship. He really is writing about ethics. His vision for us is somehow to sit in the middle of those boundary walls, carefully and attentively heeding our gene culture co-evolutionary story. For to understand what makes us distinctive as humans is also what embeds us into the multiple, delicate, interlaced envelopes in which we find ourselves bound with others here on planet Earth. Will we live accordingly? And I do believe that sort of vision is being teased out right now in other branches of the humanities. It can be found in works of theological ethics, considering our moral responsibilities to other species. It can be found in works of political ecology, seeking to define human agency at the time of the Anthropocene. It's cast very much in political theological terms in the work of, for example, Bruno Latour. And I would even suggest it's the theme of Serres' final work, which I think I was going to mainly focus on this today, but I think we've got another talk coming up, where once again, he calls us to live at that intersection of the vertical and the horizontal, such that our relationships with others and with the world would be curated not by absolute flatness, but by that moral attention to what binds us together in the greater story. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, you've fleshed out for me something that I recognize in Serres, and that is a kind of sense of species exceptionalism for the human. I definitely think it's there. my point, I guess, in response to your paper would be, isn't it more a matter of degree than of simple exceptionalism? One from the text itself, when he talked about the three houses to which we belong, in common essence. He talked about our common house, by which he's not merely referring to the human, he's also the co-presence, the cohabitation of bacteria and of cattle and what have you. This is our common house, he said. But wandering around and about outside of that, what you're describing to me, it seems to be a new iteration and perhaps a more specialized branch of what used to be referred to as epigenetics, whereby precisely those questions of behavior and culture and the interaction with genetic, the dynamics of genetic code, if you like, from generation to generation, was in play. An example we might think of is one quite cruel, in fact, whereby a flock of birds, songbirds, were not allowed to listen to each other for a generation and lost the language that had previously been accessible to their forebears, and more or less started from scratch, from ground up, but developed their own language over a course of, it was only 2 or 3 generations by the time it became as complex as it had been, and to function as it functioned for their forebears. So I wonder if that, I fully grant that there's an exceptionalism in Serres, but I wonder how forcefully he claims it himself and how far we can allow him to do so.
Well, I've been really, I was intentionally reductionistic, provocative, if you like, some of the way I meshed out those categories there, because absolutely take your point. So perhaps it was a reductio, hopefully not ad absurdum, to make a point about human nature in particular, because these are very important questions about cultural innovations in non-human species as well. However, I do think that some recent work in forms in not only in the field of cultural evolution, but in a broader field of evolutionary and biology and evolutionary psychology can be very helpful here. And I'm thinking about transmission modes like social learning, imitation, language, and so on. And I know that for people like Celia Hayes at Oxford are beginning to pick up some of these themes from Serres. So there might be some heuristic value, even if it's not pure exegesis, if you like. And with regards to your point about species adaptation, really important question as well. And that might describe exactly that sort of punctuated burst. And so the question is, to what degree is that culture? And even if it is culture amongst those birds, how does it map, first of all, onto Serres, which I suggest it maps very nicely, and then how does it map onto more conventional fields of evolutionary work? And I think that there's a gap there still between those two. And I would see Serres offering provocations and ways of merging certain categories that are taken too simplistically by the science. So yeah, I've been a little bit naughty in sort of flattening some of his nuance laid out just here. Yeah.
Thank you. No, thank you.
I think Charles would be very, and I think they tend to use it in 2 distinct ways: human culture and culture generally.
Yeah.
And anticipates what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. But he mentioned early on in the incandescent work of Michel Serres, who wrote what he mentioned is microcosm. and she talks about the history of bacteria, which is going back billions of years. And she said, bacteria have been talking to each other for billions of years. Globalization goes back billions of years. And he says, and as we mentioned the book, the bacteria of colour filters in a way that's even more originally than music, which is based back billions of years. By going towards a billion-year-old era, he says to early bacteria, my vision drinks its fill of these colours like they do. Yeah. So this isn't human exceptionalism, and I can't see human exceptionalism in well, I can, but it's he says humans are good for nothing. Yeah, they're absolutely good for nothing. Whereas Socrates, they're very, very specialized. Yeah. So there is obviously a thing, we're in a different situation and we're completely messed up. But Margilis, and I'll get back to it, says how all beings alive today are equally evolved. That's how she sees it. All survive in common to so, you know, that nature culture division doesn't exist from the beginning. That's my reading of Serres. Culture and nature are not divided in anything.
Agreed, and that's why I said one mustn't fall off the horse in either direction. One mustn't determine the virtue of human cultural specializations that are distinctive, we might say, but neither must we forget that we come from that shared evolutionary trunk. And of course, he would say things like, he calls them conservatories. Cultural conservatories give us a certain depth of memory, the span of a single life, the family tradition, a piece of art, Roman art, a cave painting on a wall. But none of those cultural conservatories are as deep as natural conservatories, rock strata, DNA, space, etc. So I'm not looking to restate a nature cultural bifurcation at all. And obviously that is the entire program of Serres' natural philosophy, if you like. But I think he is subtly teasing out, if you like, heuristic categories that can help us understand our shared origins, as it were. Interesting, you mentioned Margulis. My own work I've done a lot of work on James Lovelock. And when I was working in the Lovelock archives at the National Science Collections in Wharton, I came across somebody had suggested there was something called the Rainbow Notebook, which the archive are still the boxes that were in his garage. No one has yet. So I found this book underneath these in one of the 500 boxes underneath a stack of journals. And it was a rainbow book because it had different colored pages, 50 green, 50 green. And on the green pages, he had thoughts about religion. And there on I think page 3, it simply said, it was scrawled like this. It simply said, Gaia, ... end of modernist teleology. And I think what he meant by that is that it does indeed, his theory of homeostatic and regulatory Earth system processes does indeed enable us to get out of the modernist interlude and the separation of nature and culture to something much more original and helpful and then forward facing as a political and ethical program. So he was very keen himself to find the ethics that came out of his science.
Yeah, and I'll be talking about Gaia.
Right, you're doing something on Gaia, yeah. So Bruno Latour, if you were to ask him, what is your politics? He would say it's a Gaian politics. So he's beginning to make those connections.
Thanks for the paper. I think I've got a version of the same question, but I have a lot of colleagues who are very interested in the concept of One Health. If you've not come across this, it's an idea from quite an old idea from public health about the intersection of different systems. So a kind of classic example would be antimicrobial resistance, which is a human behavioural problem and changing people's behaviour with taking antibiotics. But it's also a problem of dairy and cattle and the amount of antibiotics we pump into the supply chain when it comes to eating meat and so on. So all of the problems are interconnected in different ways. I wonder from the perspective of nature as integral of all the bifurcations, I just wonder how the health bit of One Health looks from that perspective. I suppose I was interested in the bits in Incandescent about living with viruses and living with bacteria. Are you able to do any work with the health bit in this thing?
Well, I think you could say that what is ethics for the 21st century? Let's start there. It's detail. It's to always ask for more. It's to always trace the footprint deeper. And we can see in palpable ways how that relates to our environmental challenges, where the footprint of our consumption is rendered intentionally impossible to trace. You make a decision about an iPhone, you're already making a negative decision about some other extraction practice. And so that I think, yes, One Health, it seems to me extremely healthy as an idea to always ask for more, to always dig deeper, to go down and down and down and begin to see where these imbrications are to be found. Yeah. And I think that our modernist epistemology is designed to do precisely the opposite to that, isn't it? To pinpoint and diagnose singular factors that are entirely explanatory. So a dose of Earth system thinking or planetary system thinking seems to me just the tonic we need for the century.
Yeah, thanks for that paper. I want to present you a worry as a kind of provocation from my side. And so we talked about nature culture, and you alluded a number of times to technology. It's basically kind of question, how does that fit in? You know, that enigmatic notion of axial Darwinism also in Serres. And provocation is a bit like this, like how does Serres, in the thinking of humans are totipotent or avians, how is it different from these traditions in philosophy of technology that stress exactly the same point, that human nature has no nature and technology fills in that in the advanced see that going back to Laura has a set connection, or even that kind of traditions are called real, and it's tough to see technology as this kind of actual Darwin way of thinking. So the provocation is, does there have anything to that? Do we need there? And that's mainly really awful worry for myself. So I don't know how.
Yeah, well, these are the questions I work on really in my day job, which is understanding, for example, what does agricultural technology mean? What would a Heideggerian critique of technology say? Because it's interesting, is that his phenomenological field is so impoverished in that essay. He's still working at the level of, hydroelectric dams on the Rhine. It doesn't seem to fit at all the type of subtle, nuanced, reactive technologies that we can now bring to bear. So I think Serres can give us a sort of phenomenological expansion of our view, if you like. I think he has, it's just like I said, really, technology as a function of culture is an innovation that can allow us we can embrace it as part of our freedom, which is really contrary to the predominant sort of left critique of technicity, if you like. And I think he's got particular traction in the area of genetics. So my institute works on questions of gene drives and genetic technologies, and we're encountering there a huge array of cultural, political, social factors, as well as technological. We've got American scientists going into communities in Latin America and saying, hey, we've got this technology to eradicate screwworms that are causing damage to your crops and animals. Let's do it. And all these Catholic majority countries are saying, we don't think we do want to do it actually, because we have alternative values, and there might be arguments about slippery slope or playing God or whatever it is. So we just need this far rounder diagnostic. And I think that's where he can help us.
Same kind of continuous story that we interpret technology and biology as but that kind of dichotomy is also well destroyed, it seems, to their thinking. Would say follows that line.
Yeah, and I think he comes. I would be interested to read an article sometime about his links to the Catholic personalist tradition, because I think he comes out of this tradition that has an understanding of humans as transcendental. So this is now in a sort of Catholic discourse. And it's through that sort of heritage that he can think more holistically about technology and its impact on the human. And I really like that about him, that he is constructive and productive in thinking about the nature technology binary, if you like, in a way that I just don't see elsewhere, even in Brunner-Latour, actually, who I think has been critiqued for overemphasizing one over the other.
Do you know about Alison Jolly and the evolution of hair? I think it's even more pleasant. I think about it about 3 or 4 times a week. It's such a nice thing to think about, which is I think it's better than the lactase thing.
Yeah.
So why do human beings have the hair on our head, and why does it keep growing? You don't have to cut your cat's fur. Why? And why only on the head? And Alison Jolly, you know, quite recently, she's dead now. She was an anthropologist at Sussex, so we can have hairstyles. And that's really very profound and far-reaching. That it's, you know, there's so much pleasure. Initially, one must presume, kind of undirected. That's nice. Oh, I wonder if you can maybe kind of tie it up in a knot. That would be good. And then, more importantly, what if I was so powerful and important I could get someone to do the bits around the back that I can't read? Anyway, so you know, it somehow gets into our genes that we have hair that you can style. But the question I want to ask is, why do we think this is us? You know, Sarah likes to quote that little bit of Aesop in which a fly sitting on a chariot wheel says, "What a lot of dust I'm throwing up." So is that us or the hair? What's doing it? And our assumption is that we've got to the point where we can actually do things. Cows are not actually doing anything. And we can assign what we love to call, I hate this word, agencies. We can assign agencies, but you know, maybe these really need to be thought of as, I'm just improvising here, as quasi-subjects. Sarah talks about quasi-objects, but you know, things that from a certain kind of point of view look as though they're directing the way things are. I once said in the company of a biologist, this is really always a bad idea, human beings are the first beings that are restricting, radically reflecting on ways of restricting their own spheres of operations.
Yeah.
And the biologist said, brood reduction, lots of animals decide who lives and who dies.
Yeah, we're only considering that after we've expanded massively beyond our natural boundaries, as it were. But there are evolutionary reasons for that too.
At that point, once you start thinking that big, why do we stop thinking big at the point at which we think, hey, look at what a lot of dust we're raising?
I do like that idea of the hair. Actually, that's the third category, because usually non-functional phenotypic traits are often considered either exaptive, which is that they've been repurposed, or vestigial, so you know, nipples on male, they're no longer functional. But that hair is both non-functional and necessary.
Yeah,
if you
sexual
like.
selection.
So, well, maybe that would be a different thing again.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just for the joy of having different hairstyles as well somehow. in the world.
Yeah, so maybe it's joy that's doing it. You know, it's just, you know, who's in charge? Who's driving this chariot?
Chimpanzees go out to get drunk.
Yes. Yes, I once heard a conversation at Cambridge pub and said, well, why do, and I came at the end of it, why do you think chimpanzees like to dance in the rain? And the person's interlocutor, quick as a flash, said, perhaps it's the Kelly gene.
There is one.
The gene Kelly.
That's the sort of company. I like it.
That's right.
I like it.
It's in the mill pub.
Actually, there's a Fred and Ginger gene.
Is there actually?
You know, they're actually.
They're actually.
Yeah.
I bet there should be.
We've got 2 minutes. I'd just like to sneak. I can't turn the camera around. I'm sorry, Bernadette. I can't turn the camera around far enough to see me, but I hope you can hear to some extent. Tim, it's something that you said early on, a quote I think from Lactase, not a miracle, but a very low probability, that quotation. And of course, it puts you in mind of Badiou, for whom precisely change is a miracle, and you need that miracle for novelty. And so people from a Badiouian stable listening to that quotation will think, okay, well, so there's nothing radically new then. There's no interruption, there's no break, there's no possibility of resistance instead, because there isn't this miracle. And so I'm wanting to push you on that a bit and say, does that leave Serres then, you know, when all the fighting's over, with a position that is fundamentally deterministic?
Yes, or conservative. Well, I think there is no radical break in the unified concept of nature, because it's, as I said, it's subject to the processes of cause and effect that characterize the Earth system. And although they are unimaginably complicated, they're not unentangleable, if you like. But I don't think that renders him conservative, because you don't want to fall off on the other side of the horse either, as we've said. And even if we want to extend cultural specialization to other things beyond the human, we might want to do that. So this slight surprise of action that Latour would say and got from Serres is found in precisely on that side of the horse, but not on the other. But it's not to say that the the processes of life on Earth aren't complicated and don't look. That's why he took us in that quote right to the edge of a miracle. It looks so much like a miracle, and to all extents and purposes, it is, because we could never get back down and untangle all that in practice. So I think there's, yes, I wouldn't agree with that Badiouian metaphysic, if you like, myself, but I think there's plenty of room for radical emergence in this system.
Thank you.